Hello everybody and welcome to this video on Realms of Arkania Star Trail. This is a new PlayStation 4 release. It has been kicking around on PC for quite a while, as you can probably tell from the graphics. It's an older game. The original release was actually back when the Elder Scrolls Arena, which is the first one, was new. So we're talking about a very old PC game here. This is a remake of sorts, which was released a fair few years ago itself. But thanks to a publisher, it's now available on PlayStation 4 for the first time, and I felt like I wanted to talk about it because I'm actually a huge fan of old computer RPGs. I've been playing them for a very long time. In fact, the likes of Eye of the Beholder and Wake of the Ravager and those kinds of games are actually the things that I used to play the most back when JRPGs were not a big deal in Australia and you didn't get too many of them. I had a PC which I played basically everything that was Dungeons and Dragons-ish I could get my hands on. I never actually played this one when it was new. I missed it. This is the first time I've actually played this game, and I really like it. I've got a review going up on the digitlydownloaded.net website, but I wanted to use this video to give you a sense, I guess, of what the game is and what it's about. And you know, these kinds of games, they always come with a warning that unless you probably grew up with older RPGs, you might miss the point of them, you might miss the appeal of them, and so I wanted to use this video, I guess, to provide a bit of a warning about it. It's not going to be for everyone, but if you do have fond memories of the early Elder Scroll games and the Dungeons and Dragons games of yesteryear, you will probably find this one quite enjoyable. So as you would have seen, there's a couple of different gameplay structures in Star Trail. The first one is first-person mode of sorts, or first-person mode, which looks a bit like, I guess, an Elder Scrolls game. That happens when you're in dungeons or towns only, so you get to explore the towns and the dungeons where most of the storytelling and most of the role-playing happens in first person, so you get to have that kind of connection to the characters in the world and get a sense that each town is different in its own way and all that kind of stuff. When you're actually travelling between towns, and you'll see this in a bit, you actually have a overworld map which you just point a cursor at and click, and the party moves from point A to point B. There'll be some encounters that happen as you do that, but it's a very kind of static map, and you're just kind of watching a little icon move its way around. That happened because, you know, as I already said, this is an older game. It would have been impossible to render the entire world in the technology they had then, or probably the technology they have now. The world is actually really huge, and the kind of the spaces that the developers wanted to take up meant that that map system, which you'll see again in a moment, is probably the only way that they would have been able to approach that. The third type of gameplay that's within Realms of Arkania is a tactics combat system, which you would have seen just a little bit at the start of the video. There's a bigger section of it in a bit, but it plays out, I guess, a bit like a Fire Emblem or a Final Fantasy Tactics, if you're familiar with those games. So between the three of them, you get quite a bit of variety in terms of the gameplay, and it meshes together pretty well, I've got to say. And this is the map section I mentioned previously. So just like in any RPG, you move from town to town, completing quests. Either you're following the main storyline or you indulge in some side quests and things like that. Each town has its own problems, its own issues that you can help resolve, or you can just focus on going on to the next major mission, I guess, and keeping the overall plot moving forwards. The thing that's really noticeable about this game is that the storytelling is really classical and traditional in tone and nature. So if you grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons, especially the way that Dungeons and Dragons was kind of structured back on the first and second editions, then this will feel really familiar to you, and that's kind of, I guess, the appeal of the game. Going back and playing it again today is that nostalgia, the idea that you build a party of heroes, and it's all relatively straightforward and simple. You go into dungeons, the skills are all quite simple, the story is very simple, that doesn't get too bogged down, I guess, in the kind of the moralizing and all of that kind of stuff that's been introduced in RPGs more recently. And that simplicity is really appealing. It's not for want of words. This game can get very, very wordy, and it kind of is a fairly slow-paced game, but it's got everything that you would expect in an RPG. The elves don't like the dwarves, so for example, and vice versa of course. So for example, in the first kind of dwarven area you go into, the first village, one of your goals is actually to go into a dungeon that's there and start to look for a precious artifact. And if you have an elf in your party, the dwarves won't even let you into the cave system. So the way that I got around that was to cast an invisibility spell on the elf that was in my party, and then they didn't really realise that I had one, so they let me through. But there are other solutions that you can do to try and work around that, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of creativity in how you can actually go about playing this game as well. It's fairly open, and I know that sounds a little bit strange because I just said that the overworld map is quite linear and you can only kind of follow the paths as such, but the gameplay itself is quite open, and what really facilitates that is the sheer number of skills that your characters can develop as they play. The game itself is quite slow-paced, as I said, and meandering, and you'll be doing a lot of reading and all that, but one of the things that is absolutely slowest is when your characters level up, because when they do, you get given a whole bunch of points which you can use to upgrade various abilities, which is fairly normal, I guess, for RPGs, and people will be familiar with that. But they also have dozens, and I'm not joking, dozens of different spells and abilities that you can level up each individually. Some are particularly useful in combat, of course. Other abilities are more useful in social situations. So for a very easy example, you can level up your character's ability to dance, and then when they can dance, they can perform at inns for a bit of extra cash, which you can then use to obviously rest at a better quality room and improve your character's health that way, or buy better equipment, of course, all of that kind of stuff. So you've got to really balance out the skills that you develop, and while the game does have an auto level up option, which does automatically assign skill points based on what the game thinks you need, it's not great, and I recommend that if you do play this game, to spend the time to actually level up your characters yourself and individually. It will take you a while, but that's part of the appeal of this kind of game, is actually taking your time to play it. And I feel with, especially even with modern RPGs, you know, stuff like Skyrim or Dragon Age Inquisition, I love those games, but at the same time, there's this edge that's been added to them in recent years to really push you forwards, to keep you moving, to keep you doing stuff, to make it as active as possible. And to me, having grown up with playing those older RPGs, there's an appeal to games taking their time and allowing you to take your time while playing them and not really pushing you to make quick decisions that really I really like and I kind of miss from modern RPG design. The other reason that I really recommend spending the time to level up your characters yourself is that you really make them your own character, and then that really helps when it comes to the combat system of the game, because this is a fairly involved combat system, and that's what you're now seeing on the screen in front of you. This is actually the very first battle that you will fight in the game, so it's not that much more than a tutorial, but even then it kind of shows you just how methodical the game's combat is, and what it actually requires of you as the player to really get involved with it. As you can see, it's a little bit like a tactics thing, but each of your characters has all of those abilities to use, and you kind of need to figure out which are the right abilities to use. There's a thing, older RPGs have this thing where the ability to miss an opponent is a statistic that you need to take very seriously, which sounds a little bit odd, I guess, but it was kind of a feature of the early Dungeons & Dragons games and a lot of the other pen and paper RPGs at the time. In addition to your characters doing more damage as they leveled up and got better equipment, they also became more likely to hit the opponent. And modern RPG design is kind of different in that the developers figure that the ability to miss means that it's kind of wasted time while you're playing. So most of the time as characters level up, they do more damage and become more resilient to damage, but right from level 1, the percentage chances of hitting the opponent are usually pretty high. So in this when you come to a combat system like this one, you'll actually spend a lot of time not hitting anything and wondering what's going wrong, and then you'll realize that you need to spend a lot of time really paying attention to the chances of connecting an attack with an opponent and finding ways to buff that, whether you use magic or equipment or whatever else. Anything you can do to improve your chances to hit becomes a pretty significant strategic consideration, which I find really enjoyable, and again very retro, and it's very archaic by modern standards, but it's just something I grew up playing, I guess, so the chance to go back and do it again is really appealing. But yeah, so as you can see, line of sight is important, and you have to maneuver characters around so you can ensure that. Look at all the different spells I have to choose between to deal with all the various situations. Some spells heal, some spells do damage, and all of that is actually available to characters from the very first level, the very first fight. So you can get a sense for how overwhelming this game could be if you're not that familiar with RPGs, and try and step into it. Most RPGs by today's standards give you one or two skills to start with, let you get familiar with them, and then start adding more and more depth into it right from the very first battle. This game has a lot of depth, and the tutorials aren't great, it must be said, so you need to take the time to get familiar with them and all that kind of stuff. So again, this is not a game for people who aren't familiar with the genre, but for people who grew up with it, there's that nostalgic appeal. One other thing I'd like to say is that I wish that more publishers and developers look to their back catalogue and look for ways to bring them to console. A lot of those older games you can actually play on PC, which is great, and it's really good that they're preserving games and you're able to play these kinds of classics. But obviously the PlayStation 4 is powerful enough, and the Xbox One, powerful enough to handle emulating these older games and rendering them and running them. So it would be nice for the publishers to give people the chance to play them on their console if they prefer as well, because a lot of these games I guess people wouldn't have had the chance to play if they didn't have PCs and never really been into PC gaming, but have enjoyed playing console games. And a lot of modern console games were stuff that would never have been released on consoles in the past. A lot of Western RPGs, for example, Pillars of Eternity or Numenera, Tides of Numenera, those kinds of games are available on PlayStation 4 but would never have been released on console previously. So people who pick them up on the console and really like them might want to go back and see kind of the history that led up to those games' release. And it would be great if they didn't have to have a PC to do it, because not everybody is into PC gaming. And this game is also available on PC, of course, and you can play it on PC and it works just as well. It's been there for a few years, but the option to be able to play it on console is a really nice touch as well. So I'm really glad that this game is on PS4, as well as its predecessor. Its predecessor is not as good, I have to say. The series as such really hit its stride with this particular title, but it's good that these games are on there, and it's good that UIG, which is the publisher, has taken these kind of older games and stuck them on there, along with some of the simulation games that it's released. It's released a Transport Tycoon game or two, so there's those as well. So yeah, I hope that these games are enough of a success that we start to see more classics also emulated and ported to console. So thanks very much for listening, and we will see you at the next video.